Make sure you get all the spots. I know I'm trying.
I love looking at the trees when they're like this.
We've been looking for a quiet place like this for a while.
It's perfect for a relaxing afternoon.
Are you okay?
I think I twisted my ankle.
I'm just gonna lie down for a bit.
Are you feeling all right, ma'am?
I've been thinking about what you said.
And what have you decided?
When she was rowing, and I love talking about things that are close to my heart.
It's a difficult situation, but we must persevere for our children.
The day began under a pale, washed-out sky, the kind that hinted at rain but never quite committed. And in that still, almost suffocating calm, Hang's mother tightened the scarf around her head, adjusted the worn straps of the small basket on her back, and set out toward the ridge that loomed beyond the village. She had done this journey countless times before, but this time was different. Her mind was set on one purpose alone: to find the rare medicinal herbs her daughter-in-law desperately needed. The last of the home supply had been used the night before, and while most people would have sent someone younger or gone to the town pharmacy, Hang's mother had always trusted the old ways, the remedies she had learned from her own mother decades ago. The climb was not easy. The trail wound through dense undergrowth, the soil soft and uneven from the week's earlier rains, and every few steps she had to steady herself with the long walking stick she carried. Birds called out from high branches, unseen in the thick canopy, and far off, the sound of rushing water echoed from the river. She ignored the ache in her knees, the faint throbbing in her lower back, focusing instead on the thought of her son's wife, pale and weak, lying on her mat at home. Hours passed. The sun had shifted from behind the morning mist to a hard, glaring light that filtered through the leaves in shards, and she found herself at the familiar slope where the medicinal plants grew. She crouched low, searching among the tangled roots and dry grass, and after some time, she spotted the telltale green blades of the herb she sought. Relief surged through her, but as she bent to cut the stems, her foot slipped on a patch of loose earth. In an instant, she was tumbling sideways, her walking stick clattering down the hill, and a sharp pain shot up her leg as her ankle twisted under her weight. She cried out, the sound lost in the wide, empty air of the hillside. When she tried to stand, her leg buckled, sending her back down into the dirt. Gritting her teeth, she dragged herself toward the nearest tree for support, but even leaning against it, the pain was so sharp it left her breathless. She looked at the basket, now half filled with herbs, and knew she could not carry it, not in this state. The hours that followed blurred into a haze of discomfort and stubborn determination. She thought of the journey home, of the long stretch of rocky trail and the crossing over the narrow stream, and she knew she could not make it. The afternoon cooled into early evening, shadows stretching long across the ridge, and still she sat there, back against the tree, clutching her leg. Meanwhile, in the village, Hang returned from work, his shirt damp with sweat and his mind on the simple comforts of home. He was greeted by his wife, who looked worried. The lines between her brows deepened. She told him the medicine for her illness was gone, and when he asked if his mother had returned from her errands, she hesitated before admitting she hadn't seen her since yesterday. A prickling unease ran down his spine. He stepped outside, scanning the yard, calling for her in the direction of the garden. But there was no answer. He went to the neighbors, one after another, until one elderly man mentioned seeing her headed toward the ridge the morning before. Without another word, Hang grabbed a bottle of water, his jacket, and set off in the direction indicated. The trail was familiar, yet every bend and turn seemed heavier with dread. He pushed himself harder than usual, his boots pounding the dirt, his eyes scanning for any sign, an abandoned basket, a broken branch, a scrap of cloth. The sun was dipping lower, staining the sky in pale orange when he heard it. The faintest rustle, followed by a weak voice calling his name. He froze, listening, then turned sharply toward the sound. And there she was, slumped against a tree, her face pale but her eyes lighting up at the sight of him. "Mother!" he called, racing forward, kneeling beside her. He examined her leg, the swelling already pronounced around the ankle. She tried to insist she was fine, that she just needed a moment, but he ignored her words, sliding one arm under her knees, the other around her back, and lifting her onto his shoulders. She protested, saying she was too heavy, but he tightened his grip and began the slow, careful trek back down the ridge. Every step was deliberate, his muscles burning from the effort, but he never loosened his hold. They reached the village just as the last light was fading, and his wife hurried out to meet them, taking in the sight with a gasp. Inside, they settled his mother onto the mat, and his wife began gently washing the dirt from her hands and face, preparing a bowl of warm rice porridge. Hang brought a basin of water and knelt to examine the injury again. He urged her to let him take her to the clinic, but she shook her head firmly, insisting that a simple herbal rub would be enough. She had never been one to rely on doctors unless absolutely necessary. That night, as the three of them sat together in the dim glow of the oil lamp, the air thick with the scent of the medicinal herbs drying nearby, Hang found himself quietly grateful that the worst had been avoided. The ridge could have kept her, the fall could have been worse, but she was here, safe, stubborn as ever. He promised himself he would never again let her venture that far alone, no matter how strong she claimed to be. And though she said nothing, the way her hand lingered on his arm told him she understood. By the time dawn broke the next day, a thin mist had crept over the village, curling through the bamboo fences and pooling in the dips of the dirt road. Hang had barely slept, waking every few hours to check on his mother. She was stubborn, of course, insisting she was fine, insisting the swelling was not that bad. But he had seen the way her face tightened when she moved her ankle even slightly. The herbal rub she had insisted on using gave off a sharp, earthy scent that filled the house, mingling with the faint aroma of steamed rice from the kitchen. Hang's wife moved quietly around the room, bringing a warm cloth to his mother's forehead, refilling her tea, and checking the pot on the stove. Hang sat on a low stool by his mother's mat, watching her with a quiet vigilance. She noticed, of course. "You should be at work," she murmured, but there was no real reprimand in her tone. He shook his head. "The mill can wait." It wasn't just the injury that kept him there. It was the unspoken fear still sitting in his chest from the night before. The image of her alone on the ridge burned into his mind. After breakfast, Hang decided to speak frankly. He told his mother she could no longer go alone to the hills for herbs. Her lips pressed into a thin line, the lines in her face deepening. "If I don't go, who will?" she asked. Hang glanced toward his wife, who had paused in her cooking to listen. "We will," he said simply, "together, or I'll send someone." His mother huffed, as if the very idea offended her pride, but she didn't argue further. Outside, the village was already coming to life. Children ran along the road chasing a ragged ball, the sound of their laughter echoing off the wooden walls. The rhythmic thud of an axe chopping wood carried from a neighbor's yard. Hang stepped outside for a moment to clear his thoughts, leaning against the bamboo railing. That's when he saw Mr. Bin, an older man who often went up the ridge to collect honey, heading toward his house. "I heard what happened to your mother," Mr. Bin said. "You're lucky you found her before nightfall. Wolves have been roaming near the upper trail again." Hang's chest tightened at the thought. He thanked the man and returned inside, more convinced than ever that he needed to protect her from another such ordeal. Later that morning, Hang went through the basket his mother had carried back. The herbs were still fresh, their scent pungent and clean. He realized she must have pushed herself beyond exhaustion to gather so much before she fell. It was her way of showing love. quiet, tireless, often at the expense of her own well-being. When she saw him handling the herbs, she waved him closer. "This one," she said, pointing to a cluster of thin green leaves, "is for fever. You boil it gently. This one for wounds. Dry it first." Her voice softened when she spoke about them, each plant a memory, a tradition passed down. He realized then that it wasn't just about fetching medicine. It was about preserving something she valued deeply. That afternoon, a few neighbors came by to check on her. Some brought food, steamed buns, sweet rice cakes, while others just sat and chatted, filling the house with warmth. Hang noticed his mother's eyes brighten at their company, even though she still winced when moving her leg. In the late afternoon, Hang's younger cousin, a medical student from the nearby town, arrived. She examined the ankle carefully, nodding approvingly at the herbal treatment, but warning that it needed to be wrapped properly to prevent further injury. She also urged his mother to rest for at least 2 weeks, advice that made the old woman scoff, but agree reluctantly. That evening, Hang prepared dinner himself, a simple meal of grilled fish, stir-fried vegetables, and hot soup. As they ate, the conversation turned to old stories. His father's youthful misadventures, the first time Hang tried to herd goats and failed spectacularly, the winter when the river froze and the entire village had to share firewood. The air was filled with laughter, but beneath it, Hang's mind remained restless. He couldn't shake the image of his mother lying on that cold slope, her voice calling out faintly. He resolved that the next time she wanted herbs, he'd be the one to climb the ridge, even if it meant rearranging his work. Before bed, he sat beside her again. She was already half asleep, the soft glow of the oil lamp casting shadows on her face. For a long moment, he simply watched her breathe, feeling the quiet weight of responsibility settle over him, not as a burden, but as a promise that no matter how stubborn she was, no matter how much she insisted on her independence, he would be there to carry her home if she ever needed him again. By the time the first rooster crowed the next morning, Hang was already awake, sitting on the small veranda with a cup of hot tea steaming in his hands. The night's events and the quiet conversations with his mother had planted a knot of determination in his chest. Today, he was going to make sure this kind of scare never happened again. The village air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wet earth from the previous night's drizzle. Somewhere far off, the sound of a cow's bell clanged rhythmically. Hang's wife emerged from the kitchen carrying a basket of laundry, giving him a small smile before heading toward the river. Inside, his mother was still asleep, her breathing slow and steady, the herbal rub drying on her ankle in a faint sheen. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen her sleep so peacefully. It almost made him hesitate to wake her when the morning sun began to spill into the room. But there were things he needed to say, and he wanted her to hear them before the day swallowed his time. When she stirred, rubbing her eyes, he gently broached the topic of changing how they gathered herbs. "We can talk to the cooperative," he suggested. "They can send someone younger to make the trips, or we can set up a schedule so you're never alone." She gave him that sideways glance he knew so well, the one that said she was weighing his words but not ready to concede. And if they don't know the right plants? If they pick the wrong route? It's not just about fetching things, it's about knowing what you're looking for. He leaned forward, meeting her gaze. "Then teach me." The words surprised them both. For a moment, she seemed to search his face, as if trying to decide whether he was serious. "You? Climbing hills and crawling through brush? You'd rather be at your mill, shouting at your workers." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I've been shouting too much. Maybe it's time I learned something quieter." By mid-morning, they had moved outside, the sunlight warm on their backs as his mother laid out bundles of herbs on a bamboo mat, naming each one. She told stories about how her own mother had taught her, stories of narrow escapes from sudden storms, of trading rare roots for rice during a lean winter, of how certain plants only revealed themselves to those patient enough to wait. Hang listened closely, committing each detail to memory. Every so often, a neighbor passing by would stop to greet them, offering a sympathetic word about her injury and promising to keep an eye out if they saw her wandering too far. But despite the friendliness, Hang noticed something else. Small murmurs about how dangerous the upper ridge had become, how a wild boar had been spotted near the trail, how the old suspension bridge's ropes were fraying. These weren't just idle warnings. They painted a picture of real risk. That afternoon, Hang's cousin returned with more medical supplies, including a sturdy cane. His mother protested, of course, claiming she didn't need a stick to lean on like an old woman. But Hang quietly set it by her mat anyway. He also took his cousin aside, asking about arranging regular check-ins just in case. As the sun began to set, casting long golden streaks across the courtyard, Hang helped his wife prepare dinner, a hearty stew of pork, taro, and fresh greens. His mother sat nearby, shelling peanuts and occasionally interjecting with teasing remarks about his cooking skills. They ate together, the soft clink of chopsticks punctuating the comfortable silence. But after the meal, Hang found himself restless again. He stepped outside, gazing toward the dark line of the ridge against the deepening sky. In his mind, he could see the winding path his mother had taken, could almost feel the cold bite of the wind up there. He clenched his fists. It wasn't just about keeping her safe. It was about making sure she never had to prove her strength in such dangerous ways again. The next morning, he planned to speak to the village head to see if they could organize safer ways to gather herbs or even cultivate some closer to home. As he returned inside, he noticed his mother watching him, her expression softer now. She didn't say anything, but he thought he saw the faintest trace of approval in her eyes. Maybe she understood in her own quiet way that his stubbornness came from the same place as hers, a deep, unshakable love for family, a love that would always find its way back home, no matter how far the climb.